Hello and welcome again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I am going to continue on my little kick of talking about evidence-based medicine. One of the things that I will simply say is that due to my new information or what I came across with respect to the central piece of information as to why evidence-based medicine seems to give me such a hard time, in that its initial instantiation came from the motivation to teach how to interpret research evidence and then apply to medical care. Keep in mind, medical care, physician care, that's where it's from. It was a teaching attempt. It was an attempt to teach those skills and grow those skills in a rigorous fashion from a positivist epistemology. I am not going to argue against a positivist epistemology. In fact, it's my favorite approach to many things. It doesn't mean it's my only approach to all things. It just means I do have a penchant for appreciating a positivist approach more than any other epistemological approach. That said, if you only have a positivist approach, you are probably missing out on some stuff. If you use a positivist approach, you believe fundamentally that there is a singular reality that can be identified through appropriate experimentation, and the experimenter is always the issue. The way that you deal with the experimenter being the issue is you set forth rigorous, standardized, step-by-step protocol to minimize and remove the issue of the experimenter. So if you are going to attempt to say that evidence-based medicine isn't a step-by-step approach for how you hierarchically view sources of evidence, for how you examine a given study, or for how you would then use that tool to examine a group of studies and turn it into a meta-analysis, you're out of your damn mind. If you think EBM and EBP do not have a rigid, standard, step-by-step protocol, you're nuts. If you acknowledge that they're there and they have their benefits when appropriate, then you're probably in a good place. But if you think that EBM is this end-all, be-all, the way to make clinical decisions, especially in an uncertain field such as all hands-on therapeutic fields, whereby the evidence present doesn't fit properly into a meta-analysis, you're not going to get a good signal because these studies are done from multiple epistemologies and from multiple experimental methodologies. Therefore, your ability to turn into a meta is essentially non-existent. Therefore, you're consistently going to say that there's no evidence for this, that, or the other. Then you don't understand what the heck you're doing from bedrock. You don't properly understand the scientific method and scientific approach. You don't understand hypothetical or deductive approach properly. You don't understand how to make a prediction, how to test it. You also don't understand that there are huge assumptions in all of those things. So my previous argument, that if you care to look back, you can find that science, the application, the performance of science requires faith. And faith as defined as the willingness to believe that something that cannot be currently observed is possible to observe. So you can set up an appropriate experiment such that if the thing can be observed, you can observe it, and if it cannot be observed, you will not observe it. Therefore, it's falsifiable. So that sets the stage for me to just show you something that I'm doing right now. I'm trying to do it as much on the fly as possible. Obviously, I've read a little bit. Went to Google Scholar, and what's this term? I put in, so this is actually something that is important. When you're searching, if you're going to do, say, a meta-analysis, when you're searching for anything, you have to, prior to that, to do a meta-analysis properly, you have to formulate a question to query current evidence. The formulation of that question has axiological or value-based choices. You are also setting up a barrier within which you're going to search and outside of which you are not. You must then generate inclusion and exclusion criteria. You then have to create search terms. You have to search for specific things in the literature, and depending on the search terms and depending on how the term returns, you will find some stuff and you will miss other stuff that may be germane just because it's the wrong term. So the other deal, as already noted in a previous video with respect to meta-analyses, inclusion criteria means you have judged those things which you are willing to consider and also judge those things you will not consider. Therefore, those things you will not consider are not represented in any of the answer or any of the aggregated data that you put there. One of the problems with large data sets, while it will amplify signal, it will also dampen outliers heavily. If your hierarchical preference is to dampen outliers so you can figure out a stronger confidence interval across a larger set of data, then you are fundamentally ignoring the level of application of healthcare. It is not to a large data set. It is to an individual, okay? Keep in mind, healthcare is targeted at an individual. It happens between multiple individuals, but it is always targeted at one. So you could have multiple hands-on therapists treating one person, but they're all targeting the same person. So the application is the individual, never the group. You do not treat a group. It doesn't happen. It's the wrong level of analysis, which means that meta-analyses automatically have a problem because you must assume that the individual target of your skill set is properly represented in that data. If you're an expert clinician, and I'm very happy to acknowledge that evidence-based medicine, conscientious, judicious application of best available evidence with clinical expertise. So they do acknowledge clinical expertise. I will never deny that. However, you put the damn evidence first, then you put the clinician, then you put the patient. This is fundamentally inaccurate, unfortunately, for how you're supposed to interact with the patient. You're supposed to be building from the patient. The evidence, the aggregated evidence that has been averaged and smoothed and has high confidence intervals, is a great place to start. And I would suggest that if you present this argument to anybody who supports evidence-based medicine, the answer is, well, of course, and agreed. But the challenge becomes that you hierarchically put the damn meta-analysis at the top, and that is wrong. Okay, so the search term that I put in here, after I go off on a goddamn tangent and rant, is evidence-based medicine growth, right? So this is just the first page. This is not the first page of the Google Scholar search. The first hit is from 2014, the Navigation Guide, Evidence-Based Medicine Meets Environmental Health, a systematic review of human evidence for PFOA effects on fetal growth, right? So that's not germane. So this is the thing. When you look at search terms, you throw a search term out there and you get stuff that you don't want. This gets filtered out. So this is an active example of inclusion and exclusion. I wouldn't look at that further because I'm trying to figure out how it grew as a phenomenon with that search term. The next one is 95, on the need for evidence-based medicine. That's not going to be germane in all likelihood to what I'm trying to figure out. It may provide me insight into how the case was built in 1995, but it won't necessarily retrospectively show me how it actually happened. 2005, growth and decentralization of the medical literature, implications for evidence-based medicine. Again, not necessarily going to show you. So I'm showing you how when you're searching through data, you create a search term and you get returns, you try to figure out whether or not they're going to work for you. And usually it's very judgmental because you do it on title alone. So you're not actually going through and picking at the literature. One of the reasons you do that is because it is unreasonable to read everything. So you have to have a hierarchy, which means you are making assumptions. And in those assumptions, errors can live, or errors always live in those assumptions. However, they're not always a problem. But to show you step by step how this works, you need to know that there are assumptions, there are value judgments based on title. You're judging a book by its cover. And then you start to build from there. And that's why you have those inclusion and exclusion criteria, right? History of evidence-based medicine. So if I click on this one, just to read the quick abstract, this is probably not going to inform me for what I want, but that doesn't matter because it's at least closer, right? So I click on it, I open it up. Really quickly, this essay reviews the historical circumstances surrounding the introduction and evolution of evidence-based medicine. Criticisms of the approach are also considered. Weaknesses of the existing standards of clinical practice and efforts to bring more certainty to clinical decision-making were the foundation for evidence-based medicine, which integrates epidemiology and medical research. Okay, so that sentence right there is important because it's the claimed retrospective motivation. The retrospective claim would be based on initial reporting of this. So, nope, not that. What? There we go. No, I hit something funny. It's not doing what I want. Sorry, I was just slipping around on this device between papers, and I didn't want to do that. The weakness of existing standards. Okay, if you are a positivist, you are likely to prefer standards. The assumption being that a standard should ideally apply across the board. However, if you are a positivist and you actually look at your data and you don't smooth it out and you don't throw out outliers, you recognize that a standard is a trade-off choice that will help most of the time, but you must adjust. And that's where if you follow evidence-based medicine and include clinical expertise, your retort is simply going to be, well, we do that. Yeah, and nobody needed to be told. Nobody needed to be told that you take the research as a starting point and then adjust as needed based on response of patient, which is why I would tell you that EBM is the attempt at setting standards step-by-step approaches. Okay, then to read back into that, so there was an assumed weakness of existing standards of clinical practice and efforts to bring more certainty to clinical decision-making. If you're looking for certainty in clinical decision-making, I suggest you turn and tuck your damn tail. Certainty is not necessarily a thing. You can increase or decrease your confidence towards or away from certainty. But if you need certainty, get out. You don't need to be in healthcare. Healthcare is an uncertain thing for many reasons. One of the most fundamental reasons is humans are complex, not complicated. Complicated means that you can understand how parts interact in predictable ways such that you know if you do a specific thing, how it will then fall out through the system. A complex thing, you may know how to interact with each piece, but you don't know how they will predictably play together when you apply the appropriate thing to that piece. The outcomes will be varied and difficult to predict, if not impossible. Therefore, you are working in uncertainty. Humans are complex. Other organisms are also complex. Therefore, if you're looking for certainty, you're barking up the wrong tree. It's just not worth it, okay? So the attempt is to standardize and normalize, reduce uncertainty. I'm all for attempting to minimize uncertainty, but if you think you can remove it, you're out of your tree. You're wrong. That is just not how it's working. Doesn't matter how big you make your data. It doesn't matter how powerful you make your analysis. It's not happening because you're aggregating and setting norms. Your patients are not the norm. Your patients are the data that contributes to the pattern, but they are not the pattern. Stop it. Okay? Is there value in that? Yes, because as I've already noted, it becomes a great place to start. And then again, if you are an EBM person, you apply your clinical expertise and adjust as is needed. But nobody needed that part built. It wasn't a thing. Okay? Blah, blah, blah. The next one, next generation of evidence-based medicine, don't need that. Now, the one that is a very interesting one. Evidence-based medicine has been hijacked. A report to David Sackett. David Sackett being the noted initial person in evidence-based medicine, and then Gordon Guyatt, I believe, is the one who coined the term. So let's read this. This is from John P.A. Ioannidis, Journal of Clinical Epidemiology 2016. So I'm going to just read this. It will probably stand for itself. I likely do not need to make much commentary, but I very well may. This is a confession building on a conversation with David Sackett in 2004 when I shared with him some personal adventures in evidence-based medicine, EBM, the movement that he had spearheaded. The narrative is expanded with what ensued in the subsequent 12 years. EBM has become far more recognized and adopted in many places, but not everywhere. For example, it never acquired much influence in the USA. So when I noted in a previous video that the initial paper in EBM, that 92 paper by Gordon Guyat, with respect to the teaching of EBM, that it was basically a manifesto. They were trying to push it out to all locations, or as far as it would spread. And guess what? It didn't work in America, or it didn't work well at the time of this reporting in 2004 or in 2016. You would want to attempt to figure out why it took hold in some places and not in others. And guess what? You're not going to be able to use a positivist approach to do that. You're probably going to have to use a more constructivist approach or a more qualitative approach. Numbers aren't going to damn well cut it. But the data that you collect, you could translate into numbers because all data gets translated from raw to refined for communication. Anyways, back to reading. As EBM became more influential, it was also hijacked to serve agendas different from what it originally aimed for. Influential randomized trials are largely done by and for the benefit of an industry. So I have previously stated in multiple locations that sometimes you want to be concerned about things that drive, or the axiological choices that drive any research question or research approach. Now, here's the deal. The researchers and the funders are not hanging out together in a cabal. What's more often happening is that the funders are setting the criteria for the release of the funding. Therefore, the researcher will adjust to get the funding such that they have to do the research that the funder wants. So the funder sets the terms for receiving money. The researcher adapts. They don't have malicious intent most of the time. There are times that they may have malicious intent, but for the most part, they're just jumping through the hoops that they have to jump through to get the money, and then they'll check the boxes that they have to check. Right? So that's a thing. To get back. National and federal research funds are funneled almost exclusively to research with little relevance to health outcomes. So, yes, is evidence building in healthcare? Is it building in medicine? Absolutely. But it's not looking at the outcome. So if you're in healthcare, your primary job is to figure out what is going to provide the best outcome for the individual patient, not for the group. The group is the wrong level of analysis. So if you're not necessarily actively trying to figure out what's best for the individual in your research agenda, you're screwing up. Okay? Come back. We have supported the growth of principal investigators who excel primarily as managers, absorbing more money. Diagnosis and prognosis research and efforts to individualize treatment have fueled recurrent spurious promises. So maybe a reasonable way to abstract from that is to say that the things that have said that they're going to be individualized don't seem to work out as well. Part of that could be how they're attempting to be built, or part of it could just be overpromising. Blah, 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 blah. Under market pressure, clinical medicine has been transformed into finance-based medicine. In many places, medicine and healthcare are wasting societal resources and becoming a threat to human well-being. Science denialism and quacks are also flourishing and leading more people astray in their life choices, including health. EBM remains an unmet goal worthy to be attained. So the criticism here isn't that EBM is fundamentally poorly aimed, it's that how people are attempting to instantiate it has knowable and predictable issues. So is EBM high-minded? Yes. Does it sound really good? Yes. Is it predictably going to have problems in how it is applied to the individual? Yes, because it's done at the group level, right? Because the top of the evidence hierarchy is meta-analysis. It's just it's the wrong one, right? Anyways, so I'm going to go to something from 1997. So in 1997, let me go to the full abstract. 1997, the American Journal of Medicine, Problems in the Evidence of Evidence-Based Medicine. Abstract. I'll just read this. The proposed practice of evidence-based medicine, which calls for careful clinical judgment in evaluating the best available evidence, should be differentiated from the special collection of data regarded as suitable evidence. Although the proposed practice does not seem new, the new collection of best available information has major constraints for the care of individual patients. Derived almost exclusively from randomized trials and meta-analyses, the data do not include many types of treatments of patients seen in clinical practice, and the results show comparative efficacy of treatment for an average randomized patient, not for pertinent subgroups, formed by such cogent clinical features as severity of symptoms, illness, comorbidity, and other clinical nuances. The intention to treat analysis do not reflect important post-randomization events leading to altered treatment, and the results seldom provide subtle background data when therapy is given prophylactically rather than remedially, or when therapeutic advantages are equivocal. Randomized trial information is also seldom available for issues in etiology, diagnosis, and prognosis for clinical decisions that depend on pathophysiologic changes, psychosocial factors, and support personal preferences of patients, and strategies for giving comfort and reassurance. The laudable goal of making clinical decisions based on the evidence can be impaired by the restricted quality and scope of what is collected as best available evidence. The authoritative aura given to the collection, however, may lead to major abuses that produce inappropriate guidelines or doctrinaire dogmas for clinical practice. That is the fancy way of telling you that meta-analyses do not properly represent individuals. The meta-analyses are done and averaged. They are not the extreme patient or the grade of extremity of patient that you're actually encountering. Also, clinical decision-making. Okay, so let's put it this way. Evidence-based medicine is supposed to guide clinical decision-making, and it is dog crap at clinical decision-making because it is not how it works. It's a high-minded attempt to tell you how you should do it, but it is not how it is done. It doesn't fit how good decision makers, it doesn't fit how good clinicians and diagnosticians do what they do. It doesn't match, it's wrong. Teaching it to people creates an anchor that they stick to, and it doesn't allow them to grow into better expertise in any way other than by accident. Okay, so it is not good for clinical decision making. The other thing that it does note here, and I will tell you that this 1997 criticism may easily relate to the spurring for people to include patient-centered care because it is a more constructivist approach and it does attempt to include patient preferences, but you goddamn don't need it because autonomy in medical ethics pre-exists and does everything that you require because it requires you to consider patient preferences. It requires you to collaborate with the patient because they have to be able to say yes or no. So you have to provide them with the information and let them say yes or no. And you have to listen to their preferences because if it's, I don't want to do this, but I will do this, you're like, okay, well, let's do it. You're supposed to do that already. Patient-centered care doesn't add anything, but it does let you plug the hole in the critique. There you go. I think that does a decent job. Now, I'm going to switch over quickly to another one, evidence-based medicine and teaching. So this is the first page from the Google Scholar search. Evidence-based medicine teaching in UK medical schools. I mean, I could look at that. It's from 2009. That would likely just aggregate and tell me kind of how they're doing it. Whatever. What is the evidence that postgraduate teaching in evidence-based medicine changes anything? A systematic review. So a systematic review is a meta-analysis. The problem that you're going to run into is that if they're not collecting data on the teaching, that your meta-analysis is going to say, well, we can't really tell anything from this. So really quickly, what is the evidence that postgraduate teaching in evidence-based medicine changes anything? A systematic review. 2004, BMJ. Objective, to evaluate the effects of standalone versus clinically integrated teaching in evidence-based medicine on various outcomes in postgraduates. Design, systematic review of randomized and non-randomized control trials before and after comparison studies. Data sources, Medline, Embase, Eric Cochrane Library, DARE, HTA database, Best Evidence, BME, and SCI. Study selection, 23 studies, 4 randomized trials. 7 non-randomized controlled studies and 12 before and after comparison studies, 18 studies including 2 randomized controlled trials evaluated a standalone teaching method, and 5 studies including 2 randomized trials evaluated clinically integrated teaching method. Clinically integrated. So you're teaching the how and the why. This reflects something that was done subsequently that I've pointed to with Dr. Nicole Woods and work that she's done and supported. Dr. Jeffrey Norman was supporting Dr. Nicole Woods in the early work. Clinically integrated, you're teaching the how and the why at the same time. Dr. Nikki Woods looks mostly at basic science integrated with clinical skill. So to come back, main outcome measures: knowledge, critical appraisal skills, attitudes, and behavior. Results: standalone teaching improved knowledge but not skills. Attitudes so standalone teaching of EBM improved knowledge but not skills. Improve attitudes or behavior. Clinically integrated teaching improved knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behavior. So before Dr. Nikki Woods was doing what she was doing, starting in around 2006, or a lot of her work showed up in 2006, and subsequently the combining content and cognition, it was already identified as a phenomenon. So building on that is a reasonable thing. Teaching of evidence, the conclusion: teaching of evidence-based medicine should be moved from classrooms to clinical practice to achieve improvements in substantial outcomes. So, if you like the step-by-step processes of teaching people how to put meta-analyses and randomized controlled trials at the top of the evidence hierarchy, and you need to teach them how to evaluate it in a standardized way because you're a positivist and you like EBM, then what you need to do is put it in clinical setting. Right now, it's like, well, we already tried to. We did academic half days. You did academic half days on teaching them how to do EBM, not clinical half days and teaching them how to look at a case, gather the evidence. Like, you didn't do it. You just taught them about EBM. You didn't teach them how to integrate. And that is from 2004. I already said that. Let me go back here. Evaluating the evidence of evidence-based medicine. This is 2002. Is that the right one? Yep. Oh, so I got to click this. Let it connect. Evaluating the teaching of evidence-based medicine. An increasing number of medical schools, and Gordon Guyad is on this. Gordon Guyad is the second author here. An increasing number of medical schools and residency programs are instituting curricula for teaching the principles and practice of evidence-based medicine, EBM. For example, 95% of U.S. internal medicine residency programs have journal clubs, and 37% of U.S. and Canadian internal medicine residencies have time dedicated to EBM. Journal clubs, I do not believe, are instantiated due specifically to EBM. I would predict that they predate EBM, period, and that physicians in varying ways, in varying locations, for varying reasons, were doing journal clubs, but you also have rounds. Rounds are a normal thing, and rounds can take many forms, and they will include evaluation of literature, presentations of evaluation on literature. So journal clubs, you're just asking people to be nerdier, I guess. And guess what? Next Wednesday, I'm going to go to it's called Wildcard Wednesday from Merit at McMaster, where a paper is provided. People do talk about it, or people read it, and then people are giving a presentation and conversation ensues. So I go to them, but it's not because of EBM. The topic that I'm going to be engaging with has nothing to do with EBM. But also, that's not fair because it is an education-based thing. So I'm not being fair. 37% of U.S. and Canadian internal medicine residencies have time dedicated for EBM. That's the thing that you're probably looking for if you're Gordon Guyad. You want to see people specifically talking about EBM. So whatever. Curricula based on EBM are increasingly popular in residency programs and other specialties, including family medicine, pediatrics, obstetrics, gynecology, and surgery. Despite the widespread teaching of EBM, it's not that widespread. Or it wasn't at the time. It was growing, but it wasn't that widespread. Despite the widespread teaching of EBM, however, most of what is known about the outcomes of evidence-based curricula relies on observational data. Although the evaluation of the quality of research evidence is a core componency of EBM, the quantity and quality of the evidence for effectively teaching EBM are poor. Ironically, if one were to develop guidelines for how to teach EBM based on these results, they would be based on the lowest level of evidence. Okay, so when I noted previously that the criticism of Dr. Norman is that there's no evidence for the effectiveness of EBM, and I noted a meta-analysis, which was, I think prior to 2020, it might have been 2019, maybe even before that, I don't remember for sure, but I talked about that in a previous video, whereby evidence-based medicine doesn't really show any impact on patient outcome, but partially because it's not measured. So we know that there are methods for teaching something that can improve the outcomes, aka combining content and cognition. The meta-analysis that I previously read here shows that if you teach EBM standalone, it doesn't work well, but if you combine it, right, if you do it, what was the term? There was another term, and it's just slipping my head right now. Let me go back here. Blah, 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 blah. It's the clinically integrated. Yeah, clinically integrated teaching. Combined content and cognition, clinically integrated. That actually improves skills, knowledge, behaviors, and stuff like that. So this is a long road to travel for some, or a long road to listen for some, to get to the point where, once again, I am showing that EBM is a teaching model that is just dog crap. Because you're trying to teach people, because you believe that clinical decision making is poor, so you think the way to do that or to improve that is to make them look at evidence. So you create a hierarchy of evidence and you put randomized controlled trials at second top and meta-analysis above that. So you've made an axiological choice, but it's the wrong axiological choice because it doesn't include patients properly. It's average data, so it's too smoothed out to deal with what's actually going on in the clinic room. But it's a good place to start. Then you apply your clinical expertise. Like, no, duh, everybody would do that anyways prior to the instantiation of EBM. But you've created some things that you think if you just teach people this, they'll have the skills to evaluate the research. EBM is something built on top of the scientific method. If you teach people about ontology, epistemology, axiology, the principle of parsimony, and you teach them the specific skills of statistics, and you integrate it, and you ask them to evaluate that stuff from the bedrock, right? From the bedrock of these things, not from EBM. EBM's already injected value decisions or value-based choices or axiological choices that take you away from finding what is needed, because it's asking you to find what they value. If you're asking somebody to find what you value, then you're removing the opportunity to find what is most necessary in extreme cases. Now, as an average, is EBM a decent approach? Sure, I got no problem saying that. But it was a dog crap teaching model to start, made on assumptions and values that don't properly apply to the actual practice of healthcare. One of the major problems it has is it puts meta-analysis at the top. Meta-analysis is good for some things, and for other things, it's not so good. So the physician needs to be adjusting based on the patient at all times, and the data won't support that because you've put meta-analysis at the top, and it's the wrong thing. And meta-analysis makes a lot of assumptions and value choices in how it's done. And if you know what you're reading, you can find it. You actually have to know what the hell a meta-analysis is, how it's built, and then you can weight your confidence up or down based on what you find and its application to the situation that you're in. Clinical practice is targeted at an individual, no matter how many people are involved. I will tell you that if you want to reduce medical errors, standardized step-by-step approaches that a team of healthcare practitioners does is the best way to reduce errors broadly for the team, because handover or care of one individual by multiple individuals has the normal errors of communication. So if we do the same thing step by step, we can each catch one another when a step is done improperly or missed. But the best way for a clinician, one clinician, to reduce error commission is increase in expertise. Increase in expertise is increase in specific skill post identified error commission and adjustment, right? So it's still an iterative approach. It is the scientific approach. It is the hypothetical deductive method. You have predicted that something's going to work a particular way. It doesn't work that way. You learn and adjust subsequent to that new spot. Clinical practice is the hypothetical deductive method, or is rather, it is best described by the hypothetical deductive method. It is best informed by the skills of integrated cognition, best described as a semantic network or a network of related meaning, such that you have disparate pieces of information that you are able to take from one location and put in a new location when reasonable, when germane, when appropriate. If you look at previously made data, you look at it through blinders. You narrow. You don't widen. It is not how cognition works. So one of the ways that you can tell, or the classic way to figure out if somebody is failing at a transfer task, is you ask them for a piece of information. If they answer it, you know they have it. You know they have the piece of information cognitively. It exists inside of them in some fashion. Then what you do is you provide them a problem that requires a piece of information you've proven that they have, and they can't solve it. If they can't solve it, you now know that they fail at transfer because they can't take it from one place to another. If you combine content and cognition, if you apply the teaching of a technical skill with why that technical skill works or why it functions, what you've done is you've increased the semantic network, because you can start to think about the why independent of the how. So you have the how, and then let's just say you're trying to apply the how to a particular situation. You can think back to the why that it works, the underlying structure or the underlying mechanism, and you can attempt to build something or adjust based on the why. But if you do step-by-step stuff, and if you have a hierarchy of preference for what constitutes evidence, if it's not representing the evidence, I can't do it. Well, guess what that turns into? Trying to remove access to approaches because it's not supported by evidence. You say if it's not supported by evidence, it's dangerous. It could be dangerous, but it could be the thing that saves somebody's life. And if you remove that option, that exploratory opportunity, that scientific hypothetical deductive opportunity, you are harming future healthcare based on your preference for previously done research that doesn't apply to the situation. So, again, full-throated argument in favor of the hypothetical deductive method, full-throated acknowledgement of the benefits, and it may not sound like this, but the benefits of EBM, because the benefits are that it is a standardizable, reproducible approach to how you do things. Now, it may not be well codified, so the retort may be, it's not step by step, we learn how to evaluate evidence. I'm like, well, how do you do it? You have a preference for how it's evaluated, and you have a hierarchy of weighting. So you have a step-by-step process, you just don't call it one. But where meta-analyses are appropriate, EBM has strength. But you don't need EBM to have meta-analysis and properly evaluate the meta-analysis. Some meta-analysis are dog crap, right? They're just trash. Some are fine, but what the problem with meta-analysis is that it has a value hierarchy that you should be able to identify the evidence, and it should give you an answer. Yeah, but if the evidence is collected in a disparate amount of ways, then what you need is the technical skill set to actually look at the methodology and the epistemology that they have and evaluate that, because almost all epistemologies have the ability to present a reasonable outcome or a reasonable description of reality within the bounds of the epistemology and within the bounds of the methodology. You actually have to sometimes pick up the one paper or the 5 papers and find out what sews them together in a way that may not be doable with a meta-analysis. That's why you have things like narrative reviews. Narrative reviews carry the assumption that the expert providing them is not cherry picking, right? You've got all kinds of different forms of reviews, all kinds of meta-analyses, and they all have assumptions and they have strengths. You don't need EBM to know that. You need the technical skills to do it. But EBM could be a package that could deliver you the skills, except for the fact that it's a trash teaching model. Okay? So keep in mind, I started by pointing in the direction of my focus on the teaching model approach because I happen to have purposely built my skills in the teaching of health professions education, health science education, which does have the underlying mechanisms of teaching and learning. So I recognize now that the thing that has disturbed me the most or set me off the most is that EBM is an attempted teaching model. It's just not a good one. And then it does have growth in a variety of places, but not all places. And it's possible that in good faith it has gone errant. It is possible that in bad faith it has gone errant, but that's kind of what the heck is going on. So what I will say is, if you've listened this far, thank you. I appreciate uncertainty is something that I've said quite a bit. I appreciate it because it gives me the opportunity to explore and learn new things and increase or decrease my confidence in particular concepts. That is what you have seen thus far. If you've gotten this far, take it as an example of what actually doing science looks like while somebody's doing what you would call a talk out loud protocol. You can look that up if you feel like it. And also look up the issues with it because it's not that good. Talk out loud protocols are okay, but they're not that great. So the argument is presented. You take it how you will. Do not misrepresent what I say. Listen to what I say. Listen to the reality that I acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses of multiple approaches because they're all there. But I can also point you in the direction with respect to teaching and learning activities of what seems to most consistently work in a net positive direction, especially in a previously self-sorted group, such as healthcare practitioners who have already shown the conscientiousness and the skill to jump through most hoops. So you're not going to see large education effects in any of them. That doesn't make it an argument in favor of teaching however you want. It makes it an argument in favor of teaching in the ways that provide the most consistent positive effect sizes, even if they're small. So thank you for listening this far. Hopefully you've learned something, and we'll talk again soon.